Would you please introduce yourself to the audience? Name, specialty, academic background, and research interest.
Sure. I'm Geoff Koby, and I actually have a PhD in historical linguistics, historical Germanic linguistics, from the University of Wisconsin. I was hired here in 1994, so I've been here going on 23 years. And coming in to Kent State, I was not a translation scholar. I was somebody who could translate. I knew how. And so over the years as a translator, I walked in the door here and said, okay, what am I supposed to be teaching? And they're like, well, advanced translation for undergraduates. Like, okay, what book do I read? And Dr. Shreve handed me his the book that he wrote with Albrecht Neubert, with the 7 Standards of Textuality. It's like, here, read this. It's like, okay. So I read that before I started. But over the years then, I retooled from a historical linguist to a translation scholar. And the first thing I did was to say, okay, how can I teach translation if I'm not a professional translator myself? So I sat in with Dr. Wright on her translation class and got the sample ATA exams and so forth. And so I got ATA certified the next year. So in '95 I became ATA certified, and I started building up, expertise in translation studies. But that's not where I started at all. So and I have to say that I was the second generation of translators, translation scholars really here, because Dr. Shreve, of course, started the Institute, and then he hired Sue Ellen Wright and Carol Mayer and Françoise Massardier-Kenny as the first, German, French, and Spanish, the first 3 core people. And then after the master's degree pretty well took off, then they decided they would do the Bachelor of Science. And with the Bachelor of Science, they needed more staff. So I was hired as kind of the second wave of translation faculty. And back then, this country certainly didn't have a PhD program anywhere. And so you didn't really find a lot of people who had an actual background in translation, certainly not in empirical translation studies. And that is where my research has gone, is into empirical translation studies, and specifically into translation assessment and evaluation, so translation grading and translation pedagogy, particularly as it relates to grading.
Do you know about how translator training was first introduced at Kent State, and what role did you play at that time?
Well, I'm sure you have the stories from Dr. Shreve, because I remember him telling me about visiting Albrecht Neubert at the University of Leipzig, where they have this great big translation program. It's years old, decades old, and taking along President Michael Schwartz at the time, who said, "Oh yeah, we can have one of those here. Go hire some people." So I wasn't here in those really early years when they were building up, designing the master's program and so forth. In 1994, when I came here to Kent State, the president of the university at the time, Carol Cartwright, had decided, the administration had decided that having a separate German and Russian department, French and Romance languages, classics, where there were 4 departments of foreign languages at Kent State. And in 1993, they said, you have to merge. So I walked in 1994, and there's this brand new merged department, which is now Modern and Classical Language Studies, and nobody really quite knew how anything worked, because it was all new and it was all combined. So I came in really as the spearhead for the Bachelor of Science program, right? So the BS in translation that we have. One of our claims to fame, of course, is that we are a comprehensive program. We have a bachelor's program, a master's program, and a PhD program, which no other program in the United States has. And at that time, the master's program was a big, solid program, growing. And the Bachelor of Science had just been revised and refocused, and so I was teaching new courses that nobody had ever taught before, and we weren't sure how many majors we were going to have and how this whole thing was going to work. So as it evolved, I was teaching in both master's and the bachelor's program and coordinating the undergraduates. So for years I was advising all of the undergraduate Bachelor of Science students, regardless of which of the 4 languages they were in. I was just advising everybody. So we built that program up, and part of what we did was we went to, well, I asked to get funding, and we started advertising. And we started, that was when we started having a booth at the American Translators Association conference to build outreach, to build awareness, we're at the point now where one of my colleagues outside of Kent State refers to us as that magnificent Kent State mafia. But one of the things that I remember us doing back then that we don't do anymore is in the master's program we used to teach interpreting. And when I first came here, our current computer lab up in room 316, which is this lovely big room with lots and lots of computers and technology and so forth, it was sort of a junk room. So most of that room was full of old computers and old tables and and Dr. Shreve had his own computer server there because the university didn't have servers powerful enough for us. But the actual lab was about 12 computers over in one corner, and it was all small, and you could work, but it wasn't wonderful. And so, but that room, already then, it had the antenna around the room for picking up wireless microphones for interpreting, and then our meeting room 309 also has the wire for the pickup, and it has interpreting booths. Because Dr. Shreve thought that we would be a translation and interpreting program, and we've never gone in that direction. So we have these like archaeological artifacts of something that never really actually got off the ground. So ultimately, as we tracked to the industry, which is really one of the strengths of the IAL program, is that we have people who are very heavily grounded in the translation industry. Dr. Dunn with localization, Dr. Wright in terminology studies. I'm heavily involved with the ATA and with certification. So we've got people who know how the industry works. And that meant that when we were looking at our curriculum, we said, okay, we don't have really the expertise. Even when we hired Dr. Washburn, who's an interpreter, we just didn't have the depth, and certainly not in 3 languages back then, only 3, French, German, and Spanish. But we didn't have the faculty skills to really honestly, legitimately teach interpreting. We did have somebody with the skills to teach localization, and it seemed to be more important to the industry for our translators to go out there with good technical skills. So that's one of the big changes that we made as we developed the program. Of course, then the whole PhD program got added on, say, in the last 10 years. So that was a big change, but that also led to, if you've got lots of faculty who now have to teach courses in the PhD program, then you got to have more faculty teach in the undergraduate program, but that gave us then the PhD students who, to some extent, then started filling in at the bottom and are now teaching the classes at the undergraduate level. So it's been a kind of a gradual but steady growth and expansion. So at this point, it's broad, it's deep, and it's very well respected.
Sure it is. Speaking of the founding of the program, I want to ask about the major elements of the curriculum in the early years and how have they developed over the years?
Well, curriculum.
In terms of courses.
Yeah, well, I mentioned interpreting. That was the big change. Interpreting got switched for, I think, localization. Project management is still an option, but So, back in the master's program has not changed all that much. That if we start with the master's program, we can always say, that was always the tail that wagged the dog, because of the way language works in the United States, language study. We knew, I'm sure Dr. Shreve knew when he started up the program, certainly the early faculty knew, undergraduate students were not going to be able to be trained to be professional translators because they didn't have the language skill. So instead, they started the master's program, and that master's program has stayed more or less unchanged over the years. Theory, the practice course, the 3 specific technical courses. So the core of translation skills and translation studies has pretty much stayed the same. But then, it was nice to have an introduction to interpreting, because, every translator is going to interpret at some point. But it wasn't enough to call them interpreters, and we're very constrained in the master's curriculum because you only have 36 credits, and when you put the core in and then you say, okay, we have all these other areas that we'd like to have our students study, and you can only fit so many of them in, and there's always a pressure in our discussions about curriculum. We've talked about, well, we would like to have them have more time. Students should have more time to practice translation. Actually do it. But the more you practice translation, the less you can do translation theory, translation project management, software and computer applications. But really, those courses in the master's program have not really changed. The bachelor's program has also really not changed a lot, although we did make some changes in the early years. We had, at one point, we had the BS in translation had just been created when I came in '94, but there was still a translation option in the Bachelor of Arts. So you had students who could choose to get the translation sub-major in the Bachelor of Arts, and they were confusing the issue. So fairly early on, we got rid of that option in the Bachelor of Science program. We said, you cannot do a translation option. You've got to be a real major. But we haven't really changed any of the courses. We've fiddled with like course levels. One of the courses moved from the senior level to the junior level. Really excited things like translation studies got its own label, so that if you taught a translation studies course at the beginning, it was listed under MCLS, and now we have TRST. It's our own label. It's like, it's not really an important thing, but it does kind of give us an identity of our own. There are translation studies courses. It's actually a discipline. And then, of course, the whole PhD program is new, newish. But the interesting thing about the curricular development in the translation PhD is that we originally had a 2-option program. You could either choose to be in translation informatics and study, software design and things like that, or you could be in sort of traditional translation studies. And it became very apparent very early on that it didn't really matter which track the students chose. They were interested in the other track as well. So after the first couple of years, there were some curricular revisions to say, okay, everybody gets everything. We try and blend it into something that hits the major points of the entire field of translation studies, because everybody wanted it. Plus, we were not attracting a lot of programmers. And so if you're really talking about, if you were actually designing a tool like Trados or WordFast or something like that, you'd have to be a programmer, and translators are not programmers. Translators are more the conceptual people. So that's what the PhD students are doing.
Wow.
Okay.
So now we move to your question, which is the founding of ATISA.
Founding of ATISA.
Yeah, can you tell us about it? How did it start? Who
Yes.
were involved in that? And how does it contribute to the training of translators at Kent State or elsewhere?
Or elsewhere, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a national association. What happened with ATISA, it was originally called ATSA. It didn't have the I in it. It was ATSA. And it was the idea of the American Translation Studies Association. It wasn't my idea. It was actually Professor Douglas Robinson, whom you may have heard of, who had this idea that we needed a national association for translation studies in the United States, modeled on, there's CATS in Canada and there's EST in Europe and so forth. They're all over the place, but we didn't have one because of the kind of marginal position of languages in general, and certainly translation in the United States. So just about every year there was a session at the American Translators Association conference where Doug Robinson would organize it, and various people would get together and talk about how important it would be to have a national association. They would all agree it was important, and nobody would do it. So I attended a couple of those meetings, and I finally raised my hand and said, look, I'll organize a conference and we'll just get it started. And I think that was when was that? Was that 2001? I forget the year. But anyway, so I organized a conference one spring here at Kent State, the founding conference. We had just one room full of people. It was probably 20, 25 people in one big room, one session. And as part of that, we said, okay, we'll hold this session and everybody will give papers. So it was a real academic conference already from the beginning. And when we had discussed it, we said, okay, we need an association, we need a conference, and we need a journal. Those are the things you need to be a real scholarly association. So we started out with a conference, and at the conference we had a constituting session where we created the American Translation Studies Association, and what I actually did was I stole the bylaws from another association, rubbed off the serial numbers, changed the name, and said, okay, here, I just rewrote them a little bit, but the bylaws actually come from like a Germanic linguistics association that I was a member of, and I borrowed their bylaws. But, got the bylaws, and we held an election. And I fully expected that Doug Robinson would be the first president of ATSA. And then they elected me instead. Because we said, okay, we'll have a conference every other year, which we still do every other spring. And then we needed to get a journal started. And so we had a board. Let's see, Claudia Angelelli was the vice president. A fellow named Jonathan Hine, who is a professional translator, but he's more of a professional translator, but he also got a PhD in educational design. He always wanted to be an academic, but he never actually did. He's retired now, but he was the first secretary-treasurer. So we were the officers, and we kind of did this all sort of on our own. I found a lawyer here in Kent. We incorporated as a nonprofit, filled out all the paperwork, and then Brian Baer was selected as the first editor. He still is the editor of TIS, Translation and Interpreting Studies. And in those first years, I was like the production manager and co-editor, not so much editing the contributions. That was Brian's job, but doing the managing editor kinds of things of production and proofreading and copy editing, and we produced these things. The first several issues of TIS are home produced, self-published. So we generated the manuscript, figured out the size of the publication, consulted with Kinko's back then, and so we produced, I don't know, 100 of them. I don't know how big the first print run was, but we did the first several issues of TIS in-house and self-published, and then we ultimately got a contract with John Benjamin's, and now they publish it. And one of the best deals in academic publishing right now is if you go to the website of Benjamin's and try to subscribe to TIS. Well, if you're an institution, it costs you hundreds and hundreds of dollars. If you're an individual, it costs you like $150. Or you can pay whatever the membership is in ATISA, which is much lower than that, and the journal is included. It's part of the deal. So, joining ATISA is a really good deal, and if you want a subscription to TIS. So we incorporated, we got the journal going, we got a system going, and it became increasingly professionalized over the years. Now they have, it's kind of been, after the startup years, then the startup is always kind of precarious. People might drop out, or nobody comes to your conference or something. But the conferences have been quite successful, to the point now where they brought it to the point where you have to apply and get approved to do a conference, rather than, I volunteer to give the conference at my institution or something, which is what we did the first few years. The second conference was at University of Massachusetts Amherst with Edwin. Edwin Gensler was there, and he hosted the second conference. And then we knew people at the first 4 conferences were people we knew who volunteered, and then it got more professionalized. You have to submit a proposal and all of that. Now, what that does it does a couple of things for translation studies in the United States. It gives you a place where you can go in the United States at least every other year. So there's a kind of a domestic home for people who are located in the United States to say, okay, this is our Translation Studies Association. And is, of course, a publishing venue, which is strangely published outside of the country, but it does give the opportunity for graduate students to present their research in a conference that's not going to cost you thousands of dollars to fly to another country to present, because we're pretty much the only game in town in the United States. Although, in recent years, we've now seen from, say, SUNY Binghamton and Massachusetts, they'll have a graduate student conference, which is great. But ATISA does bring people in from all over the world, and it's thematic, but it does give that, not just for graduate students, but for everyone in translation studies in the United States. You can point to ATISA and say, here, this is our institution, this is our association.
So the founding took place here at Kent State in 2003, right?
Was it 2003? Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So 2003, we got a room in the student center, a conference room in the student center, and it was pretty much all the staff, the faculty of Kent State's program came, and then we had Edwin Gensler was there, and Holly Jacobson was there, Claudia Angelelli was there, I think. And yeah, we had this, it was a small enough group that we had the one conference room, and we all had lunch together, right? We got the boardroom, conference room, whatever that fancy dining room is in the student center, and we all sat around one big table because it was a small enough group.
And you had Bear and Wright and Bell too, I think.
Oh yeah, Dr. Bell was there. I mean, that's what I meant. The whole, pretty much the whole faculty was there. So Dr. Bell presented. Dr. Wright was there. Dr. Bear was there. Dr. Shreve, I'm sure, was there. And then we had the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences came over and gave the keynote, welcome thing. So it was a real conference, but it was nice, and it was small. It was small for the first 2-3 years. The second conference was at Massachusetts, and Dr. Gensler had managed to cram everyone in a room, and we were at the opening night reception. We got about 150 people into one small building, and all drank wine. But yeah, the first conference was here. The first publications were here, and it's become less. And I never was completely in-house. I mean, there are journals that are completely in-house in some institutions. Alicante comes to mind. But we always said that ATISA, and I should say at the second meeting in Massachusetts, I think it was Dr. Angelelli who said, translation studies includes interpreting. We should add the I. So we actually voted that second meeting. We said, okay, American Translation and Interpreting Studies Association, and that's where ATISA came from. But our mission has always been to be separate from, say, literary translation, and at the same time open to pretty much any kind of approach that it was not just literary interpretation. So it's not that the object of study can't be literary, but it should be something with a theoretical foundation or an empirical approach or whatever. Also, TIS as a publication has always been open to all kinds of translation and interpreting studies, and theoretically also including, you know, American Sign Language and anything that's related. So it's a big tent operation, and always has been. And our board always included people from all over the place, including a student member. So.
Wow. So let's now move to the computer labs here at the program. How
Okay.
have they developed over the years in response to the technological advances first and the translation market too?
Okay, could you repeat that last bit?
How did they develop in response to the translation market, to the job market, and the technological advances too?
Oh, technological advances. Okay, well, okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the computer lab originally was in the corner of the junk room. It's a little enclave of translation, of computing. Technology, particularly the software, has advanced. When I first came, Dr. Sue Ellen Wright's husband, Dr. Leland Wright, who was an adjunct faculty member here early on in Spanish, was also promoting a terminology database program that was built on the software platform of the time, and it was sort of an in-house development that a small group of people who were translators had put together. This was not a large company. There were no really large companies out there yet. And so, you know, we're all working on desktop PCs for the most part, which are running Windows 3? Not sure what version we started on. But running Windows. And so we had a lab with, you know, basically word processing software, and but we always had, as long as I've been here, we've had Trados. So in the sense that it's the leading software for, it's always been like the leading software for as a, what is it called, translation environment tool, right? As it's called, a tent. So we teach software here in order to teach concepts. So it doesn't really matter whether you're teaching Trados products or WordFast or btext or whatever. The point is, we want to teach the concepts of translation memory, of terminology management, of, you know, software localization, whatever we're doing. The particular tool doesn't matter, but we settled on the, it was Trados back then. SDL had not yet bought it. And so we had desktop machines running Trados. We had a small number of machines, and, you know, the physical layout makes a difference too. Our one computer classroom was Satterfield 313, and at the time it had been already updated. Dr. Shreve was very talented at getting capital grants and things like that for equipment. So we had the latest, you know, IBM PC desktop machines, but the physical layout was not really conducive to a computer classroom. So it's a fairly small, narrow room, 313. The movable wall that's there now, that used to be a wall. That used to be physically there. And all of the computers were around the edge of the room, facing the wall. The idea being that this was a computer lab that you could also teach classes in, because we didn't have a lot of computers otherwise. So you had a central console, and we would sit there and we would demonstrate things, and the students would have to turn away from their computers to see what's up on the screen. But we've been, you know, there are no fantastic stories about huge leaps in technology, because we've always been keeping up with the technology. So there's been a, you know, 3 to 5 years we replace all the computers. And Dr. Wright can tell you much more about, you know, or Dr. Dunn, the whole software image issue in the lab machines. What do we have? Do we have SDL Trados? Do we have localization tools like Pasalo? What do we need to have on there so that everyone who teaches in that room, who teaches translation, can teach with, and this is an issue, the most recent version of the software or the most recent stable version of the software. So my personal approach has always been that I keep up with the latest version of STL Trados products, because not only professionally, but also because if we're going to teach it, we should be teaching it using the latest version of the software, which is entertaining, because when I bought Trados version 3.0, which at that time was still working, interacting with Microsoft Word. So you had Trados Workbench, and then it was working in the background kind of as an add-on to Microsoft Word. So you were actually translating in Word, which I kind of liked, actually. But we get used to change. And the new software is increasingly, incrementally adding features that make translators' jobs easier. So it's important for us to keep up with the latest technology, and at the same time to remember that we're teaching principles. We're teaching translation memory, we're teaching terminology, we're not teaching Trados. But it's a nice side effect for students in the master's program that when they go out, they can say, yes, I'm familiar with STL Trados products, I know how they work. I can use it, coming out the door. But, so you have that technology, and then the software, and this is the one thing where I would say we're getting a little bit behind, and part of it is just maintaining the computer image and making sure it's stable and it works, is that software localization as a class is a little bit behind the curve, in that it was cutting edge when it was designed, and it is now kind of falling behind. It's time for us to update those tools. So because this is typical of the evolution of software, that things that were a problem in 2007, that problem got solved in later versions of the software so that you didn't have to work around it. So teaching the workaround is no longer necessary. So, all right?
Yeah. So now to the concluding question. So with the concluding remark now, what message would you like to send to the future students here at Kent, faculty members, future newcomers to the field? So the floor is yours. Say whatever you want.
Boy, those are two or three different constituencies. I'll tell you that.
This video is going to stay on the website maybe for a very long time. So
nothing ever disappears from the internet.
Yeah, it's going to stay there. So
yes. Well, gosh, fundamentally, I'll go back to my own interest in translation quality, and say everything that we do here and everything that we otherwise have focused on has all been aimed at making it possible for students to achieve better quality translations, to act as high quality professionals who are well trained. And so, the message is keep your eye on quality. And that means, for students, it means make sure your language skills are up to snuff, right? Make sure but I want the students to watch this before they come here and say, it's like, go abroad, learn the language, learn the culture, but then learn to care, learn to be careful, and learn to question all of your assumptions to make sure that you're doing the best job you can.